Single mom crying on a strange grave, not knowing the person. Standing next to him is a Mafia boss. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold more than 3 hours ago, yet I kept sipping it, as if that faint bitterness could somehow keep me awake. 14 hours. That was how long I had been inside the psychological support unit at Lincoln Medical Center in Chicago. A long, relentless day, spent counseling one grieving mother after another, listening to young men fresh out of prison trying to find their footing, and to children who no longer wanted to speak to anyone. I was 36, a single mother, and honestly, I could not remember the last time I had slept through an entire night. The exhaustion had seeped into my bones, the way a small scar still lingered across the back of my right hand from when I bumped into the corner of a cabinet shortly after giving birth. In those days when I could not manage even 3 straight hours of rest. It was a Tuesday, close to midnight, when I finally ended my shift, closed the last file, nodded briefly to a coworker, and stepped out of the office. The building always felt different at this hour. The voices, the sobs, the knocks on the door asking for help during the day had all faded away, leaving behind an uncanny quiet, almost peaceful. Almost. I pushed open the emergency exit and stepped into the biting October night. The Chicago cold slapped straight across my face, the kind of damp chill that no number of layers could ever fend off. The parking lot stretched before me, nearly empty except for a few scattered cars under dim yellow lights that flickered as if begging to be replaced. Though no one had cared enough to do it, I had parked at the farthest corner, next to an old iron fence, because when I arrived early that morning all the closer spots had already been taken by the night shift. My old pickup waited there, paint peeling in wide patches, the side mirror cracked from a scrape at the grocery store last year, and the oil warning light glowing stubbornly no matter how often I changed it. Still, it ran, and for now, that was enough. I was halfway across the lot when I suddenly remembered I had left my umbrella in the break room. Again. Lately I had been forgetting small things like that. My house keys, my phone, even lunch some days. My mind was cluttered with nameless worries. Then, without warning, the rain came. A downpour so heavy I could barely see a few steps ahead. October in Chicago was always like this. Sunshine one moment and sheets of rain the next. I started running, the keys in my pocket clinking together, my thin shirt already soaked through. Cold water crept down the back of my neck, slid along my spine. My pants clung to my skin, and my shoes slipped on the wet concrete. Then my foot caught on something. Maybe a crack. Maybe just clumsiness after a day too long. My ankle twisted, and I went down hard. The breath was knocked out of me. My knees hit the pavement first, then both palms scraped against the rough surface as I tried to catch myself. A sharp pain shot from my knees up through my hip. My pants tore, skin split open, blood mingled with rain. I stayed there, kneeling on the cold ground in a puddle at the edge of an empty parking lot, past midnight. Rain kept pouring over my head, soaking my hair, my clothes. My hands burned, my knees throbbed, and something inside me broke. Not a bone, something deeper, something that had been held back too long, a dam giving way. I began to cry. Not the quiet, controlled kind of crying I did in the bathroom between parent meetings or while waiting in the car outside my son's school. This was real crying, the kind that felt like a scream rising from somewhere buried deep inside, something I had been pressing down for years. The sobs tore through my chest, raw and aching. The tears mixed with rain, until I could no longer tell which was which. My body shook, from cold, from pain, from shame, from sheer weariness, from everything. Because I no longer knew how to live like a normal person. I was just a 36-year-old woman finishing another shift, worrying about tuition payments, trying not to cry in front of the people I was supposed to help hold together. But tonight, when no one was looking, when no one needed me to be strong, I fell apart, and I cried. I cried until I was empty, cried until it felt like my heart might split open, cried because I did not know why I was here anymore, or where I was headed. I only knew I could not bear another minute of it. Before we continue with the next part of this story, if something in these quiet reflections has stirred something in you, I gently invite you to subscribe to the YouTube channel, Dear Single Mom, so you won't miss the raw and heartfelt stories we share every day. If you saw even a part of yourself in this journey, press like, and consider sharing the video with someone who might be silently waiting for a moment of comfort. Where are you listening to this story from? Leave a comment below and let me know. Every place, every message from you is proof that this story has truly reached someone's heart, somewhere out there. And now, let us continue with the second chapter of this extraordinary journey. I did not know how long I had been sitting there in the rain. It might have been 10 minutes, or maybe longer. Only when the water began to soak through the lining of my shoes, numbing my toes, did I finally struggle to my feet. My knees ached sharply, my hands burned, my ankle throbbed, but I did not cry anymore. There were no tears left. Only the sound of rain drumming on the metal roof, each drop striking the truck with a hollow, rhythmic emptiness. I dragged myself to the pickup, opened the door, and sank into the driver's seat like a machine out of power. I did not start the engine. I did not go anywhere. I simply sat there in the dark, listening to the steady tapping of rain against the windshield. My hands were still trembling slightly. Inside me was a silence so deep it felt like a void. I did not think about tomorrow. I did not think about my son asleep at home, or the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. My mind circled around a single memory. A name. Francesca. I had never known her, had never met her. Yet somehow, that name had been echoing in my mind for weeks, like a sad melody with no ending. Who was Francesca? I did not know. All I knew was that I first saw her name carved into a black stone headstone, lying quietly among the rows of graves at Oakside Cemetery, on the very day my son turned 6. I had nothing to give him that year except a ham sandwich and an apology. That evening, I drove aimlessly after work, without destination, until I found myself at Oakside, a place I had never been before. The sky had been drizzling, much like tonight. I walked among the graves, stopping without reason before that one stone. Francesca Moretti, born 1956, died 2022. A mother, a grandmother, a friend. No photo, no fresh flowers, only a few dried rose petals pressed beneath a clouded pane of glass. Yet something in that name made me stand still for a long time. From that day on, I went back often. No one knew. I told no one. Whenever the pressure inside me grew too heavy, whenever I felt close to breaking, I would return to that grave, sit in front of it, and whisper to a stranger that I was sorry. Sorry for not being a good mother. Sorry for not keeping my family together. Sorry for letting life slip from my hands. Francesca never answered, of course, but I always felt, however irrational it might seem, that if someone had once been a mother, had once loved her child with all her heart, then she would understand me, she would forgive me. And Francesca, in the silence of the dead, became the only one I could speak to without fear of being judged. I do not know what connected me to her. Perhaps just a name. Perhaps a single moment when I needed someone to lean on, even if only in my imagination. But from that night, my sadness was no longer shapeless. It had a form. It had an address. And the name Francesca became a strange kind of anchor in my life. I began bringing her small bouquets bought from the corner shop, sometimes white daisies, sometimes dried lavender. I told her about my son, about my work, about the dull ache that never left my chest. There were days I simply sat there for hours, hand resting on the cold stone, eyes closed, letting the tears come without needing to explain. And then I would drive home, feeling a little lighter. Not happier, not healed, but enough. Enough to get up the next morning, enough to take my son to school, to brew the coffee, to keep living. Francesca became a quiet part of my existence, unknown to anyone but me, and perhaps to her, if anything of her remained to feel. I do not think I was losing my mind. I think when people have nowhere left to hold on to, they build their own shelter. And that grave, that name, was mine in the endless days without escape. That night, as I sat in the truck, soaked, exhausted, and hollow, I thought of Francesca as if she were family, someone who could listen, even from beyond existence. And in that moment, beneath the cold rain and the dark sky, I decided I would go to her again, not to complain, but to say thank you. Because perhaps she was the only one who had kept me from falling completely apart, a woman long gone, yet the only anchor I had left. Francesca Moretti. That name followed me into sleep that night, and I did not know then that only a few days later, that name would pull me into a world entirely different, a world I had never dared to imagine. That Saturday morning was colder than usual. The sky did not rain, but heavy gray clouds stretched across it like a thick veil of mist, casting a dim and frozen hush over the city. I woke before 6, without an alarm, without my son's voice or the familiar sound of car horns outside. I woke because of a feeling that was too clear to ignore. Today, I needed to go to the cemetery, not to hide, not to escape, but to finally speak aloud what I had been carrying inside for so long. For the first time, after weeks of coming and going like a shadow, I would truly speak to Francesca. I made coffee, then a cup of hot chocolate, and quietly set it by my son's bed. He was still asleep, curled under his thin blanket like a small cat. I left a note on the nightstand saying that Mommy had gone out for a bit and would be home before he woke. The paper was not new. I had written those same words more times than I could remember, but this time, my hand trembled slightly as I pressed the pen to the page. I did not know why. I only felt the weight in my chest, as if I were about to step into a place where my emotions could no longer hide. I drove through the empty streets where the traffic lights still blinked yellow. Chicago on an early weekend morning always carried a strange calm, an almost gentle quiet. When I turned onto the dirt road leading to Oakside Cemetery, the sun had yet to pierce the thick layer of clouds. The ground was damp, dew still clinging to the grass, and my thin scarf did little to keep the chill from sinking into my chest. I carried a small bundle of dried lavender wrapped in old newspaper, the only thing I thought Francesca might have liked, if she were still alive. I did not know why I thought that, only that the pale purple color always soothed me somehow. I walked slowly between the rows of graves, quietly, as though afraid of disturbing someone's sleep. Every grave held a story, a life, a memory. Then I stopped before the familiar headstone, the name already etched deeply into my mind. Francesca Moretti. No fresh flowers, only the faded rose petals from my last visit. I knelt down, placed the lavender beside the stone, brushed away a thin film of dust, and sighed. My breath turned into mist in the cold air. I did not speak right away. I just looked at the name and let the tears come, unhidden. Today I was not here to hide. I was here to say what I should have said long ago. Francesca, I'm sorry. My voice came out softly, as if it might shatter if I spoke any louder. I did not know who she had been, how she had lived, who she had loved or lost, but I knew that somehow, a part of me had leaned on her name as the only place that could still hold me up. I had no mother to confide in, no close friend to share with. I had my son, but he was too young to understand why his mother sometimes sat for hours staring at nothing. I had been living as though duty and responsibility were all that was left of me, moving like a machine that kept running until the battery wore out. But here, before this grave, in the silence, I was allowed to be myself, to be weak, to be sad, to be in pain, to breathe. I am sorry if my presence disturbs you. I am sorry for speaking so much without your permission. I am sorry that sometimes I have thought of you as family, though you never knew who I was. The wind moved through the trees, whispering with a kind of mournful grace. I closed my eyes, clasped my hands, bowed my head. I said these words not to be forgiven, but because I needed to say them. I needed to admit that I had been fragile, that I needed someone, even if it was only a name carved in stone, to remind me that I was still human. I stayed there a long time. I did not check the clock. Time no longer mattered. When I finally stood, the sky was still heavy with clouds, the morning barely breaking through. I straightened my scarf and took a deep breath. For the first time in months, my chest felt a little lighter. I was not healed, not happier, but something inside me had shifted. Softer, looser, perhaps because I had spoken, perhaps because Francesca, in whatever way a spirit might hear, had listened. I turned to leave, unaware that just behind me, at a distance where he would not be seen, a man stood beneath the shadow of a tree. His eyes, dark and gray as smoke, followed me without blinking. And for the first time since the day his mother, Francesca, had died, Daniel Moretti felt something stir inside him. A strange woman had just apologized to his mother, and he had heard every word. Since that morning, Oakside Cemetery became a fixed point in the rhythm of my weeks. Not a place for weeping anymore, not a place to hide, but something more like a quiet ritual, strange and private, known only to me. I chose Wednesday mornings. Always Wednesday. That was the day my son didn't have physical education and could stay longer at home with the sitter. I would rise early, brew a strong pot of black coffee, wrap a small bouquet of simple flowers, usually lavender or white daisies, and drive through still empty streets, reaching Oakside just as the sun edged over the roof of the old church. Each visit, I would wipe the dust from the stone, replace the old flowers with new ones, sit down, and begin to talk, not aloud, but in my mind, as if she could hear. I would share fragments of my week, stories about my son, updates from work at the counseling center, thoughts that clung to me and refused to let go. One time, I brought a cup of hot tea and placed it by the grave, whispering that, if she were still here, maybe she would have preferred tea over coffee. Silly words, small gestures, but for me, they were the things that kept me from slipping too far over the edge. Francesca, in some quiet and inexplicable way, had become the witness to my small attempts at rebuilding a life. At some point, I started calling it my journey of atonement. Not for her, or for the dead in general, but for myself. For the 21-year-old girl who dropped out of school after an unplanned pregnancy. For the young mother who screamed from sleep deprivation, who once thought about giving up when her bank account balance sank to a few dollars. For the woman who had numbed herself into believing she no longer deserved to be loved. I atoned by not giving up, by showing up every week with fresh flowers, keeping the grass around the stone trimmed, offering a stranger the kind of gentle care she may have once deserved. Over time, the cemetery stopped feeling like a place of sorrow. It became the one space where I felt most like myself. Not a mother, not a counselor, not a woman barely staying afloat under the weight of bills and memories. Just me, a person trying. I never realized someone else might also visit Francesca's grave. I had never seen any sign, except once a few red carnations laid gently at the base of the stone. I didn't think much of it. Maybe a former coworker, a passing visitor, someone who recognized her name. I didn't ask, didn't investigate. The world between me and Francesca already felt sacred, personal. But one morning, as I laid down my flowers and began gently clearing the wilted leaves gathered around the base, something shifted in the air. The wind didn't feel soft the way it usually did. The quiet grew heavier, almost still, as if someone were watching from just beyond my sight. I turned, saw nothing. Only rows of stones, leafless trees, and the faint calls of birds stirring in the autumn chill. I told myself I was imagining things. Lately, I had been too anxious, always on edge, like my mind couldn't rest. I let out a small laugh, shook my head, and kept working. But the feeling lingered. Quiet, persistent, as though the thread that connected me to Francesca was no longer one way, as though someone else was also listening. I never told anyone, not because I was afraid, but because there weren't words for what I felt. All I knew was that after that day, every time I came back, I'd brush my hair a little neater, wipe the dirt from my shoes, wear a coat that looked nicer than the others. Not for Francesca, but for a vague, unspoken sense that I was no longer entirely alone here. A few weeks later, I saw it. A silver lighter, carefully placed on the edge of the gravestone. It wasn't mine. And that was the first moment I knew I wasn't the only one with a ritual on Wednesday mornings. I didn't know who the other person was, but their invisible presence made me start to choose my words more carefully, even the ones I whispered only in thought. Because maybe, one day, I would have to face the person who was silently sharing this sacred space with me. And I didn't know that person was Daniel Moretti, Francesca's son, a man who, in just a few weeks, would change the entire course of my life in a way I never could have imagined. That Wednesday morning, a gentle rain was falling, not the kind that sends people rushing for cover, but the sort that lingers, steady and whispering, working its way into your hair, the collar of your coat, seeping slowly into your bones until the chill feels like it's coming from within. Still, I went to Oakside, as I always did, with a bundle of white daisies in hand, my canvas shoes soaked through from the long stretch of grass by the cemetery's edge. Raindrops dotted the windshield, and the wipers moved back and forth with a soft, rhythmic hush. I sat in the car for a long time, looking through the glass toward that familiar headstone. Even in the rain, I recognized the place. No map, no need to count the rows. I simply knew, as if my body had memorized the way by feel, not sight. I opened the door, stepped out with the flowers. The ground was soft and slick beneath my feet, the mud pulling gently at my soles, leaving faint impressions behind. I knelt as I always did, replacing the old bouquet, brushing away the fallen twigs, wiping a new layer of moss that had grown after last week's storm. I was about to sit down, carefully pulling up the legs of my pants to avoid the wet soil, when a movement caught in the corner of my eye stopped me mid-motion. Someone was standing not far away. A man, maybe 10 meters back, quiet beneath an old maple tree. He had no umbrella, no hat. Rain soaked his hair, his shoulders, the long, dark gray coat he wore, and yet he didn't move. Just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, eyes on me. I turned fully, stepping back slightly, not out of fear, but from surprise. It was the first time I'd seen another person in this part of the cemetery at this hour. Every other time, it had been just me. I studied his face, searching for some trace of familiarity, wondering if he'd come through the medical center where I worked, or from one of the community counseling events. But no, he was a stranger. Deep brown eyes, sharp features, a square jaw, eyebrows drawn together as if weighing something silently. I nodded, out of instinct and politeness. He didn't return the gesture. The way he looked at me didn't feel accidental. It wasn't the glance of someone who had just stumbled upon another visitor. It was the gaze of someone who had seen me before. Many times. I turned back to the grave, exhaled slowly, trying to steady my breath. I didn't want the presence of a stranger to unravel my ritual. I lowered myself to the ground again, slower now. My fingers found the cold edge of the stone. I whispered a few thoughts in my mind, as I always did, though the sense of being watched tingled across my neck like a thread pulled too tight. Then I heard footsteps. Soft, measured, unhurried. The sound of leather shoes pressing gently on damp leaves carried clearly in the quiet, wet air. He approached, stopping just a few feet behind me. I looked up. Our eyes met. He said nothing at first, just looked. His gaze held something I couldn't name. Not anger, not detachment, maybe sadness, or perhaps caution. Then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, the kind of voice shaped by years of keeping quiet. "You come here every Wednesday." It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly. I just feel like I need to. I didn't know her. I owe her a thank you. He glanced down at the new flowers I'd brought. His eyes flicked to the edge of my coat, where the mud had left a faint mark. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said softly, "She was my mother." My heart clenched. It was like something inside me dropped, like a note played wrong in the middle of a familiar song. I opened my mouth but couldn't find words. For the first time, I felt I had crossed a line, simply by being there. I bowed my head. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't mean to intrude. I didn't mean to take anyone's place. I didn't know where else to go." He didn't respond with anger, didn't recoil. Instead, his voice came again, low and deliberate, as if recalling something long past. "My mother hated white daisies," he said. "But if she saw the way you cared for her grave, she might have let it go." I looked up. There was a faint smile at the corner of his mouth, so fleeting it nearly didn't exist. Then he turned and walked away. No further words. The rain kept falling, quiet and cold. I remained there, my heart heavy with something I couldn't quite name. Embarrassment, perhaps, but also something deeper, because now, Francesca was no longer the only one who knew I came, and that man, Daniel Moretti, had seen me in one of the most unguarded moments of my life. I didn't return to the cemetery the following Wednesday. It wasn't fear that kept me away, nor the feeling that I had somehow overstayed my welcome. It was because Daniel Moretti's presence had shifted something deep inside me. Oakside was no longer the quiet refuge it once was. From the moment he said that Francesca was his mother, the fragile distance I had built within myself began to waver. It felt as if I had accidentally stepped into a story that didn't belong to me. That Wednesday morning, I spent hours at my desk, staring out the window while a patient's file lay open before me. She was a woman struggling with post-divorce depression, but I couldn't focus on a single word. Daniel's name kept circling through my mind like an echo that refused to fade. There was something about the man who had stood in the rain that day, something unsettlingly complex. It wasn't that he spoke so little. It wasn't the sorrow or sharpness behind his gaze. It was that within his eyes, I sensed another layer, one I could not reach. A hidden danger cloaked in calm. A weight that only comes from a life shaped by too many storms. The way he stood, the way he spoke, and most of all, that final line before he walked away, it blurred the line between two worlds, and I realized I was standing somewhere in the middle. A few days later, I found myself typing his name into a search bar, my hands trembling slightly, my heart beating too fast. There wasn't much information. In fact, there was almost none, but I didn't need much to understand who I might be looking up. The name Moretti was not unfamiliar in Chicago. I had heard it whispered in the hallways of the medical center, from night shift guards at the hospital on the west side. The name always came with rumors, never confirmed, never disproven. Stories about an old Italian family that once ruled a part of the South Side with invisible authority. About disappearances no one solved. Bars that closed overnight, houses that caught fire in the dark. Every tale, in one way or another, led back to that name, Moretti. I turned off the screen and leaned back, a coldness spreading slowly through my palms. Francesca had been his mother, a woman I once thought of as a silent guardian, someone whose memory had steadied me when I was about to break. But now, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure who I had really been speaking to, or what shadows trailed behind the quiet, restrained man I'd met that day. Perhaps his silence hid a darkness, or perhaps it hid a heart that had been broken too often. Either way, I couldn't deny it anymore. I was being pulled into his orbit. I stayed away from Oakside for 3 weeks. During that time, I buried myself in work, poured my energy into caring for my son, and filled my days with small, ordinary things: laundry, groceries, reading bedtime stories. But there were still moments, quiet ones, when I found myself missing the grave, missing the cold stone, the flowers I always brought, the calm of whispering into the stillness of someone long gone. By the 4th week, I decided to go back. I didn't bring flowers or tea this time. I just went, because I needed clarity. Winter had arrived by then. The air sliced against my skin. I wore a thick coat, pulled the hood up, and buried my hands deep in my pockets. When I reached Francesca's grave, I wasn't surprised to find someone already there: Daniel. The same dark gray coat, the same worn leather shoes, the same unreadable gaze. He turned toward me and nodded once. I nodded back. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves around my feet. Finally, he broke the silence. "You didn't come for a few weeks." "I know," I said quietly. "I needed time to think." He nodded, his eyes never leaving the gravestone. "I don't think my mother ever expected anyone to visit her after she passed, especially not a stranger." I turned slightly toward him. "What about you?" I asked. He paused before answering. "I think she would rest easier knowing someone like you comes here. Someone who keeps this place clean, who talks to her, even when she can't talk back." There was a long silence between us, soft and heavy. Then I spoke, my voice trembling with something that felt both like confession and surrender. "I come here because I don't have anyone else to lean on. But if my being here makes you uncomfortable, I'll stop coming." Daniel looked at me for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No, don't go. My mother liked company, and I've started to get used to yours." The wind rose again, and a fine drizzle began to fall, misting the air between us. I stood there beside him, unsure what to call the feeling that stirred in my chest. I didn't truly know who he was, not yet, but I sensed that I had stepped into his life somehow and that he, in turn, had stepped into mine. Daniel Moretti. A name tied to shadows and rumors. Yet in that moment, he was only a man, quietly mourning his mother. And somehow, without meaning to, I had touched the last unguarded part of him that still knew how to feel. Daniel began showing up at the cemetery more often, not just on Wednesday mornings. There were late afternoons when I'd barely stepped into Oakside and would already see him there, hands in the pockets of his coat, head slightly bowed, his gaze resting long and still on the stone etched with Francesca's name. We didn't speak much, but the silence between us had lost its awkwardness. Once, he brought a bouquet of pale pink peonies and laid them down with a care so precise it felt like each petal carried its own private weight. I didn't ask. He didn't explain. Somehow, the unspoken things between us became a stronger thread than anything that could be said aloud. But on a cold December morning, when the first dusting of snow had begun to fall, he broke that stillness with a question that made my chest tighten. "You're a doctor, aren't you?" I froze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I used to be a surgeon, but now I only work in psychological trauma counseling. I support patients recovering from emotional injury." "Why do you ask?" Daniel met my eyes. There was no accusation in his look, no coldness, only a disarming directness, as though he'd been carrying the question in silence for a long time and had finally decided to let it breathe. "My mother died in the hospital." I nodded again, quietly. "I know." He narrowed his eyes slightly, as though holding something back, working to keep his voice from tilting under the weight of it. "They said it was acute heart failure, but the report mentioned a delay in emergency response." I remembered that afternoon. A nurse had run down the hallway, panicked, searching for a doctor. An elderly patient had gone into cardiac distress. I was on duty. It had been a 16-hour shift, and back when I was still a resident, I dismissed the first signs as mild anxiety. I had made a mistake. I knew it then, and I know it now, but at that moment, I was managing 3 other emergency cases. By the time I returned to Francesca's room, she had stopped breathing. I had been there when the cardiologist arrived. I held her hand, tried everything I could, though her heart had already begun to spiral beyond saving. I knew even 10 minutes too late was still too late. I lowered my head, my hand clenched tightly inside my coat pocket. I had never thought I would have to say it out loud, especially not to her son. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I didn't do everything I could have. That was my fault. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I believe you deserve to know." He didn't respond right away. The wind picked up, pushing through the layers of my coat, making my shoulders tremble. He stood still, unmoving as stone, but his eyes were changing. They dulled, then sharpened, then clouded again. You think I didn't already know? His voice was low, nearly a whisper. I looked up, startled. I knew from the beginning. Someone inside the hospital, someone I trust, sent me the report after she died. I know who you are. I know what happened. And I know your first visit to this grave wasn't a coincidence. I stood there, breath caught. I hadn't thought he knew. No one did, outside of a few on staff. After the incident, I switched departments, avoided questions. I had kept quiet, had run from accountability, and I had punished myself in silence coming to that grave, tending to it, as if those small rituals could somehow repay a debt that had no currency. Daniel exhaled, a thin plume of steam curling from his mouth into the frozen air. I meant to hate you, he said. I meant to scare you away. But the first time I saw you sitting here, hands shaking as you laid down those flowers, I couldn't. He paused. His voice softened. You were hurting. Not the kind of hurt that hides, the kind that tries to fix something that can't be fixed. He looked up and straight at me. And I knew somehow you were the only person who really remembered her. Honestly, not because you had to, not because of duty, but because you wanted to. I bit my lip, eyes stinging. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I hadn't needed forgiveness, but in that moment, hearing Daniel say he had known all along, I understood that forgiveness doesn't always come in words. Sometimes, it is simply someone who stays beside you even after they've seen everything. I came home that night wrapped in a strange state of being. There was a kind of lightness in my chest, but it tangled with an undercurrent of unease. My conversation with Daniel at the cemetery felt like a knot finally, delicately, untied. He wasn't angry with me, or at least, not in the way I had feared, but what haunted me more than anything was the fact that he had known everything, all along. He had looked at me with the full truth in his hands, and still, he said nothing. Still, he stood beside me each Wednesday morning, never accusing, never flinching. That patience exposed something raw in me, something that no judgment ever could. I sat for hours in the living room afterward, the large lights off, only the soft amber glow of a table lamp spilling across the wall where my son had once scrawled his bright, clumsy drawings. Ryan was already asleep. I kissed his forehead gently, smoothed his blanket, and closed his door with care. These days, I felt most fragile when I watched him sleep, as though every attempt to live with dignity, to keep moving forward, gathered itself quietly into that single moment of peace. It was just past midnight when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, no name, but the area code was from Chicago. I hesitated for a second before answering. The voice on the other end was shaky, urgent, choked with the edge of panic. Miss Liz? This is Tracy, from the social work center. I didn't know who else to call. Ryan's here with me, and I think you need to come right away. The fog around me vanished. Ryan. I shot to my feet, heart pounding against my ribs. Tracy's voice trembled. He's okay, not injured. But a strange man was watching you two at the park near Lincoln. Ryan seemed really frightened. He wouldn't say much, just kept asking to call you. It took me less than 10 minutes to get there. I threw on a coat, ran out in slippers without socks, barreling down the street like someone fleeing a fire. When I arrived, Ryan was curled up in the corner of the waiting room, wide-eyed and vacant. Tracy sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. I dropped to my knees, wrapped my arms around him, pulling him into me as tight as I could. He went rigid for a moment, then collapsed into sobs in my arms. I'm here, I kept whispering. I'm here, baby. You're safe now. Mama's here. Tracy pulled me aside once he'd calmed a little, her voice low. Ryan said there was a tall man in a black coat. He stood across the street, just watching. Said he didn't move for a long time. I let Ryan play on his own for a few minutes nearby, and when he came back, he said the man had gotten closer and asked him his name. Thankfully, a passerby noticed and stepped in. The man walked away. My hands clenched at my sides. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but I could feel the tremble in my jaw. Someone had tried to approach my son, and I knew this was no coincidence. Not now. Not after what I had just confessed to Daniel Moretti. Not when I had exposed a truth to a man whose family name was still spoken in hushed tones. A name surrounded by decades of rumors and power no one could ever quite prove, but everyone instinctively respected or feared. I didn't sleep that night. Ryan curled against me in bed, startled awake more than once, whimpering softly, holding on tight. I stroked his hair, kept my voice low and steady as I soothed him, but my thoughts were a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Who had followed Ryan? Why? Was this connected to Daniel, Or was it just another terrifying coincidence in a city filled with shadows? By the time dawn crept in through the windows, pale and cold, I had typed out a message. Asterisk, asterisk, are you free? I need to talk. Asterisk, asterisk. I had never texted Daniel first. But this time, it wasn't about needing comfort. It was about needing the truth. And deep down, I knew he was the only one who could tell me what was really going on. Daniel arrived only 30 minutes after I sent the message so quickly that for a fleeting moment, I wondered if he had been watching me from afar this whole time. I had never invited him to my home before, but the moment I heard the knock on the door, I knew it was him. I didn't need to check the peephole, didn't need to ask who was there. His presence had a weight I could feel. Ryan was still asleep, utterly drained after a night that had left him shaken. I tucked the blanket around him once more, before quietly stepping to the door. Daniel stood there, wearing that same dark gray overcoat, the shoulders still dotted with a few early drops of morning rain. His eyes swept across my face for only a second, then moved past me, toward the hallway inside. He didn't ask why I had called. He simply said softly, "What happened?" I led him to the kitchen, set a kettle on the stove, though my hands were trembling too much to measure the water properly. As I told him what had happened, the late-night phone call, the fear in Tracy's voice, the frozen look on Ryan's face, Daniel's expression barely changed, but I noticed his jaw tighten. His hand rested on the table, fingers tapping in a slow, rhythmic beat against the wood, like a silent metronome counting down to something. When I finished, he was quiet for a few moments. Then, his voice came firm, deliberate. "You're not being followed by chance. That man was a message." "From who?" I asked, though the answer had already begun to bloom, dark and half-formed in my mind. Daniel leaned back, looking at me with an intensity even heavier than usual. "You're tied to a name people don't want to see return to this city. My name, Liz. You don't understand. But who I was, what I was, still lives in the memory of people who would rather forget. And when they see you next to me, see you at my mother's grave, again and again, they start asking questions." I swallowed hard. My throat burned. "So, Ryan?" He nodded. "A warning. No one wants to hurt a child unless they absolutely mean to. But they know how to make a mother afraid." I stood still, and in that stillness, something hot and deep rose inside me, not fear, not even grief, but a quiet, pulsing rage. Not at Daniel, but at the shadow he carried with him, at the life he had once lived and the way it clung to anyone who dared get close. I got up, wrapping my arms around myself, as if trying to hold in the trembling. "I can't live like this," I said. "I can't raise my son in a world where stepping outside is a gamble." Daniel didn't move. His eyes stayed on me, steady. He didn't interrupt. Then he stood, walked closer. His voice dropped, just above a whisper, rough like something that had been unused for a long time. "I know. I didn't mean to pull you into this, but it's too late now, and you need protection. I can make sure you and Ryan are safe for now." I turned toward him, met his gaze directly. "How?" He didn't flinch. "I have a house, up north, in the suburbs, about an hour outside the city. It's mine, but no one knows about it. There's no internet, no signal. I have people there I trust. You and Ryan can stay as long as you need, until I find out who's behind this." I said nothing for a long time, mostly because I was afraid, but also because I knew if I agreed to this, I would no longer be at the edge of Daniel Moretti's world. I would be inside it. This would no longer be shared silence in a cemetery. No longer careful glances exchanged between strangers slowly learning to speak. This was real, a favor, a refuge, but also the beginning of something I didn't dare name. I looked down the hallway toward Ryan's room. My son was everything. And if it meant leaving behind the familiar, abandoning the quiet ritual of Wednesday mornings, letting go of the independence I had built with grit and tears, then I would. I turned back to Daniel. His eyes were no longer cold. There was something else there now. Something like regret. I nodded, slowly, but without hesitation. "You helped me, I owe you. But if you ever bring harm to my son, even by accident, I won't forgive you." Daniel didn't smile. He simply nodded. "Once. I promise." And in that moment, I saw Daniel Moretti clearly for the first time, not as a whispered name hiding in the dark alleys of this city's past, but as a man trying to atone for something his way. And somehow, I had accepted the debt. The house Daniel had spoken of sat tucked deep among tall pine trees, so far from the main road that for a while, I thought he might be taking me somewhere that didn't exist on any map. But then, the black SUV turned onto a narrow dirt path, blanketed with fallen leaves, and beyond the trees, A 2-story wooden cabin slowly emerged, its windows lit with warm light like a quiet ember glowing against the vast darkness. Ryan had fallen asleep in my lap during the long drive. He didn't ask questions, didn't seem afraid. Maybe it was Daniel's presence that made him feel safe, or maybe children have a kind of instinct that tells them when silence is the only thing they need to give. It was already dark when we stepped inside. The scent of dry pine wood and a trace of mint lingered in the air. There was no one else. Daniel said his people had left that morning to keep the house discreet, to avoid drawing attention. I didn't ask for more. Explanations, at this point, felt like dull blades scraping across emotions that were already worn thin. After giving Ryan a bath and tucking him in upstairs, I came down to find Daniel in the kitchen, preparing dinner. It wasn't my imagination. This was the same man whose name once made my stomach twist with fear. And now here he was, standing quietly at the stove, sleeves rolled up, carefully pouring sauce over steaming pasta. The small kitchen was lit only by the soft flicker of a candle he had just lit. Its amber light cast long shadows across his face, catching the lines carved there by too many sleepless nights. We ate in silence at first. The only sound was the gentle clinking of fork against porcelain. Then, as if the stillness could no longer hold its weight, Daniel spoke. "How afraid are you of me?" My fork paused midair. I looked at him. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Sometimes, very afraid. Other times I feel so safe it surprises me." He tilted his head slightly, watching me. "That sounds like a contradiction." I smiled faintly, setting my fork down. "It's not. It's just that I've never met anyone like you. You have parts I can't quite predict. Like you're standing between two shores. One side is guilt. The other, something close to compassion." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, slowly. "I used to think there was no turning back. The things I've done, the people I've lost, the choices I made, they built a wall too high to climb over." He looked down for a beat, then met my eyes again. "But then my mother died, and standing at her grave for the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. Then you showed up, with flowers and silence, and I saw something in you that reminded me of myself. Someone trying to make amends, in their own quiet way." I didn't know how to respond. Words, in that moment, felt too clumsy, too much, so we just sat there, two people who were once strangers, both carrying wounds too deep to name, sharing a quiet dinner by candlelight, in the middle of a forest, in a house I was never meant to set foot in. I thought of my mother. She used to say, "Never trust a hand that has drawn blood." But my mother never knew there are kinds of blood that aren't about violence, but about protecting someone from something far worse. Daniel was not a good man. I knew that. He never pretended otherwise. But I also knew, when he placed a hand gently on my shoulder as I shivered from the cold draft drifting through the cabin, there was nothing in his eyes but quiet kindness. No possession, no intent, just presence. Later, as I left the table and glanced around the kitchen again, I noticed the absence of personal touches. No family photos, no signs of a life lived long here. Just a stop along the road for a man who no longer knew what direction he was heading in. I walked upstairs toward Ryan's room, my mind still full of questions, still layered with doubt. But somewhere beneath it all, something else had started to grow, trust. And that was the most frightening part, because it wasn't coming from reason, it was coming from my heart. A heart that had broken too many times to count now slowly, inexplicably, beginning to believe, in the most dangerous man I had ever known. I never thought I would step into an operating room again, especially not after the night Francesca died, the night that haunted me for nearly 2 years. But that night, in a wooden house deep in the forest, under the dim glow of a single basement light, I picked up a scalpel again. Not because I wanted to, but because there was no other choice. Daniel woke me just before midnight with a hurried knock at my door. He didn't explain much, just said someone was badly injured, couldn't be taken to a hospital, and wouldn't survive the night without immediate help. I barely had time to ask before he was already pulling me downstairs. In the basement, I found a young man lying on a long wooden table, the left side of his shirt soaked dark with blood. On the floor beside him, a crude array of medical supplies had been laid out: antiseptic, gauze, sutures, surgical scissors, a pair of forceps, everything prepared. Daniel looked at me, eyes unreadable, his voice cold and calm in a way that chilled me deeper than panic ever could. "You're the only person I trust right now. I won't let him die, but I can't do this alone." I looked at the man on the table. His chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic pulses. His skin had already gone pale from blood loss. I didn't know his name, Didn't know who he was or how he'd gotten here. All I knew was that there was still a bullet lodged in his body and time was not on our side. In that moment, every part of my professional code came crashing down. I was no longer a licensed physician, no longer tied to any hospital. I had left that world behind the day I failed Francesca. But lying in front of me was a human being on the edge of death. I drew a breath, pushed the hair back from my forehead, and nodded. Okay, but I need gloves. And more light. Daniel said nothing. He turned to do exactly what I asked, and the moment I slipped on the gloves and scrubbed my hands with the antiseptic, my fear vanished. The instinct to save a life roared back with a precision I didn't expect. My hands didn't shake. The first incision landed clean. I removed the bullet after nearly 20 minutes of silent, meticulous work. His pulse was weak, but it held. I closed the wound, cleaned it again, and motioned for Daniel to lift his head while I bandaged his torso. He did so without a word. We moved like people who had trained all their lives for this single moment. When I pulled off the gloves and scrubbed the blood from my hands, I looked down at the man breathing steadily now in unconscious peace, and the first thing I felt wasn't relief. It was guilt. I had just performed an unlicensed, undocumented surgery in a makeshift basement, without proper sterilization, without legal protection. I had broken every code I had once sworn to uphold, but I had also saved a life. I turned to Daniel. He didn't thank me. He just looked at me for a long time, then gave a single nod. I'm grateful. I exhaled, wiping my face with a cloth. I don't need your gratitude. I need the truth. Who was he? Why was he shot? Daniel looked down at the floor, quiet for a moment. One of my people. Walked into an ambush. I couldn't take him to a hospital. The police are watching. I leaned against the table's edge, hands gripping the wood. So now I'm an accessory. He didn't deny it. You can call it redemption, he said. Or betrayal of your oath. Depends on how you choose to see it. I didn't respond. All I knew was that I had crossed a moral line I once believed I never would. For a few hours that night, I wasn't a doctor. I wasn't a mother trying to protect her child. I was a human being, standing at the edge of right and wrong, trying to do the right thing in the wrong circumstances. And the most terrifying part wasn't that I had done it. It was that, deep down, I didn't regret it. That more than the blood, more than the broken oath is what kept me from sleeping the rest of the night. 3 days after that suffocating surgery in the basement of the cabin, I received a call from Monica, the head of administration at the community medical center where I used to work. Her voice came steady through the line, calm and precise as always. But beneath every word there was an edge of suspicion I couldn't ignore. Liz, are you all right? I haven't seen any of your consultation reports lately. No patient updates in almost 2 weeks. I swallowed hard. It was never easy to lie to someone like Monica. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything, the wrong date on a file, a missing signature, a shift changed without explanation. I'm sorry, I said, forcing my tone to stay even. I took a few days off. Ryan's been sick, and I haven't been feeling great either. The silence that followed lasted longer than it should have. Finally, Monica spoke again. All right, but someone came by asking about you. A man. He didn't give his name. Said he just wanted to confirm whether you really worked here. He asked about your schedule, when you last clocked in. It was odd. I got a bad feeling about it. You're not mixed up in anything, are you? That was the moment I knew. What Daniel had warned me about wasn't just paranoia, it was already happening. Someone was watching me, not only near the cabin, but in the one place I thought was still untouched, the one part of my old life that was safe. It's nothing serious, I said quietly. Probably a misunderstanding, but if anything strange happens, I'll let you know right away. I could tell she didn't believe me. I heard it in her breathing, in the faint tapping of her nails against her desk, the sound she made when she was thinking, when she was worried. Liz, she said finally, her voice softer now. You don't have to tell me anything. Just remember whatever's going on. Don't let yourself get dragged into trouble because you're trying to do the right thing. You're a good person. But sometimes good people pay the highest price. I didn't answer. I just nodded, knowing she couldn't see me. Thank you, Monica. I'll be careful. After the call ended, I sat for a long time by the upstairs window. Outside, the first flakes of snow drifted down through the trees. Downstairs, Ryan was sitting on the rug, stacking his toy blocks and laughing softly to himself. His laughter filled the cabin like a small, fragile bubble of light, untouched by the darkness pressing in from every direction. But my chest ached with unease. I thought of Monica, how she'd taken me in after Street Mary's, after I'd lost everything. She was the one who believed in me when no one else would hire a doctor tainted by scandal. And now, even she had begun to doubt me. She wasn't wrong. She was following instinct. And with someone like Monica, instinct was never something to take lightly. I knew I was walking a very thin line. Every step, every choice could drag me further into consequences I couldn't undo. That surgery, no matter that it had saved a life, was a crime. If Monica reported it, or if anyone traced it back to me, I could lose custody of Ryan. I could lose my freedom. I could go down with Daniel, even though I had never truly crossed into his world. But what frightened me most wasn't the risk. It was the realization that I no longer knew how to step back. The moment I laid that scalpel against the man's skin, I stopped being Liz, the counselor from the community clinic. I became someone else, someone living in the gray between right and wrong, someone who chose compassion over the law. That night, Daniel came home late. I waited for him in the kitchen, the dim light reflecting off the scarred wooden walls. When he walked in, I didn't ease into it. Monica called me. She suspects something. Someone asked about me. Daniel didn't look surprised. He just pulled out a chair and sat across from me. "Do you regret it?" he asked. I met his eyes. "I don't regret saving him, but I'm afraid of what that kindness is going to cost me." He nodded, gaze steady and quiet. "Every act of kindness has a price. The only question is, are you willing to pay it all the way?" I didn't answer, but I knew that with every day spent in that house, I was drifting closer to a border I had once sworn never to cross. And I realized something that chilled me more than anything else. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing a person can carry into the dark is their own goodness. Just 3 days after Monica's call, an envelope appeared on the front step of the cabin at dawn, when the grass was still heavy with fog, and Ryan was asleep on the couch, clutching his old teddy bear. Daniel was the one who found it. He didn't speak as he opened it, just gave me a dark, knowing look before setting a stack of photographs on the kitchen table. The moment I picked them up, my hands went cold. The first image was of me and Ryan standing outside the community medical center, the day I stopped by to retrieve some old case files. The next showed us at a corner cafe, sitting by the window. Then another me on the phone, my face caught mid-expression, confusion etched in the angle of my jaw. But it was the last photograph that made my knees weaken. It had been taken through the narrow crack of a door, me in the basement clinic, wrapping gauze around the wounded man after the surgery. The focus was grainy but clear enough to show my hands, the blood, the light from the single bulb overhead. Someone had been there, watching, recording. I looked up. Daniel's jaw was locked tight, the muscles along his temple flexing, his knuckles whitening against the back of a chair. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and muttered a few terse sentences in Italian, sharp, clipped, final. He didn't wait for a reply before turning back to me. "You need to get ready," he said, voice low but unwavering. "They've found you." I didn't need to ask who they times were. I'd heard their names whispered between silences, seen their shadows in Daniel's eyes. The ghosts he had once kept at bay had finally stepped out of the dark, and this time, they weren't sending a warning. They were declaring war. "I can't keep hiding in the woods," I said quietly. Daniel nodded. "And I don't intend for you to." He reached into a drawer and laid a folder on the table. Inside were photocopied documents, photographs, contact names, and a map of the city marked with small red circles. Each mark, he explained, was a place where someone had been killed, gone missing, or forced out casualties in the silent war for control within his fractured family. He pointed to a name written in bold black ink. "Franco Valetti," he said. "He's the one behind the threat. He was my father's right hand. Now he's cleaning house. Anyone still loyal to me is being erased. And you." He paused. "You've become the perfect excuse." I stepped back, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "You mean I'm being used?" Daniel's voice softened. "Not because you matter to them. Because you matter to me." Hearing that in the still air of that dim kitchen didn't warm me. It chilled me to the core. Daniel Moretti, the name that once loomed like a shadow over South Chicago, was now looking at me as though I were his last remaining weakness, and that made me dangerous. He slid the folder toward me. "We don't have a choice anymore. Either we face them, or we spend the rest of our lives running. You have a son. You can't keep running forever." I met his gaze. "What do you want me to do, Daniel?" He hesitated only a second. "Come with me tomorrow night. There's a meeting. The few people still on my side will be there. If you can confirm what you've seen, what you've lived through, it could shift everything. You won't have to speak in front of a crowd. Just a closed room. But it will matter." My heartbeat quickened. "I'm not a witness to your time's world. I'm a doctor." He stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on my shoulder. "You're the only one they'll believe hasn't been bought. You don't belong to them, and that's what gives your voice power." I turned my face away. If I do this, there's no way back. His reply was quiet, steady. No, but at least you won't be living in fear. That night, I stood for hours by the window upstairs, staring into the black forest that surrounded the house. The air was cold enough to sting. I knew exactly where I stood. One more step, and I would no longer be Liz, the woman of calm clinic mornings, of careful diagnoses, of fluorescent light and quiet compassion. I would be something else entirely. Someone who walked beside Daniel Moretti into the shadows, not as a bystander, but as a witness. Someone who would nod and confirm the truth in a world that silenced the weak. And I understood, as the wind moved through the pines outside, that from this moment on, nothing in me would ever be the same again. Not my faith, not my morality, and not my heart. That night we drove to the abandoned industrial quarter on the eastern edge of the city, where the meeting was set to take place in a warehouse that smelled of metal, dust, and smoke. Daniel was behind the wheel. I sat in the back seat, holding Ryan as he slept, his small head resting against my arm, his breath even and innocent. When we arrived, I kissed his forehead gently and handed him over to Tracy, one of Daniel's most trusted women who would take him to a safe apartment nearby, a place Daniel had prepared in case things went wrong. Before opening the car door, Daniel turned toward me. "You don't have to speak," he said quietly. "You just need to be there. They need to see you're real, not a rumor." I nodded, clutching the edge of my coat like it was the last thread of something pure I still had left. Inside, the warehouse was dim, thick with cigarette smoke curling toward the rafters. The air smelled of oil and cold iron. Faces turned as we walked in, men mostly. Older, weathered, dressed simply but with eyes as sharp as blades. At the head of the long table sat Franco Valletti. His suit was immaculate, every line precise, yet his eyes carried a feral gleam that stripped away any pretense of civility. When Daniel and I stepped into the room, the murmurs stopped. Franco spoke first, his voice smooth, wrapped in silk but carrying the chill of a knife's edge. "I'll admit, Daniel, I'm surprised. A doctor, a single mother, and she dares stand beside you in this." Daniel said nothing at first. He pulled out a chair for me, then sat across from Franco, his gaze steady. "She's not here to be threatened," he said finally. "She's here because of what she's seen." In that moment, I knew there was no going back. I told them everything briefly, clearly, without flinching. The photographs, the man wounded in the night, the envelope left at our door, the phone calls, the eyes that had been following us long before we realized. I didn't speak with fear. I spoke with exhaustion, the kind that comes when silence has become too heavy to carry. When I finished, the room fell utterly still. Franco leaned back, then let out a soft laugh. At first it was barely a sound, but it grew a slow, rolling laugh that filled the space until even the air seemed to recoil from it. "You disappoint me, Daniel," he said, rising slowly. "I thought you would fight like a Moretti, not hide behind a woman." Daniel's hands tightened on the table. His voice dropped low, deadly calm. "Watch your words, Franco. She's not a shield. She's the truth you've been trying to bury." Franco's smirk faded. He circled the table, step by step, until he stood just a few feet away, his eyes glinting. "Then truth," he said softly, "must bleed." It happened faster than thought. A man behind Franco drew his gun. I didn't have time to scream. Daniel moved first. He lunged toward me, shoving me backward, tipping the chair over and covering me with his body. The gunfire tore through the air like thunder. I felt his body jolt against mine. Warmth splattered across my neck, his blood. He didn't cry out, but I heard the sharp catch of his breath, the sound of it breaking into pain. Chaos erupted around us. Shouts, boots slamming the floor, another burst of gunfire in reply. The world dissolved into noise and red and smoke. I pressed my hands to his shoulder. Blood was pouring out fast, dark and hot. "Daniel, stay with me," I said, voice shaking. "Don't talk, just breathe." His eyes fluttered, but he forced them open. "Don't cry, Liz," he whispered. His lips barely moved. "I'm still here. I know what to do." I cut in, pressing harder on the wound. "You're going to live. You have to. For me. For Ryan. For everything you haven't had the chance to make right." He gave a faint nod, his gaze locking on mine, seeing me, memorizing me. Not as a doctor, not as a mother, but as the only person left who still believed he could be more than the man the world made him. And I understood then what it truly meant to love someone inside a storm like his. Sometimes, to protect the person you love, you don't just pay with blood. You pay with the last human part of yourself. Daniel Moretti had thrown himself between me and death without hesitation. And now it was my turn to live with that choice, to carry his blood, his shadow, his unfinished redemption. Because once someone bleeds for you, you stop being an outsider. You become part of everything. Daniel spent 3 days in recovery, not in any city hospital, where his name would have raised too many questions, but in a hidden clinic on the outskirts, a place that existed off the books. There, paperwork didn't matter, questions weren't asked, and the doctor in charge owed Daniel more than his own life. I never left his side. Not for a moment. On the first day, my hands trembled as I changed his bandages, not because of the blood, but because of the unbearable helplessness in seeing him like that. The man who had always stood like a wall between me and danger now lay still, his shoulder wrapped in white gauze, his skin pale, his breath shallow. But he never once complained of pain. He just watched me. Those eyes, unapologetic, unwavering, held no plea for pity. They were simply there, steady and alive, as they had been since the first morning I saw him standing in the rain at the cemetery. I didn't know why I stayed. Maybe because I had nowhere else to go. The cabin in the woods had burned to ashes the night of the meeting, Franco Valetti's cold way of reminding us that survival was only temporary. Tracy and Ryan had been moved again, hidden somewhere safer, and I, without really deciding, chose to stay beside Daniel. Not out of duty, not from sympathy, but because I couldn't imagine my life if he didn't wake up. On the third morning, when pale sunlight spilled through the small wooden window, and I was pouring coffee, Daniel opened his eyes. His first words weren't about the wound. He asked if I'd been sleeping. That question, simple, soft as a breath, broke something open in me. I nearly cried. I sat down at the edge of the bed, took his hand in both of mine. "I'm here," I said quietly. "I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as though swallowing something too heavy to speak. Then he squeezed my hand lightly, but enough to remind me I wasn't alone anymore. In the days that followed, he healed slowly, but steadily. We talked more not about the chaos that had brought us there, but about small, ordinary things. He told me about his childhood, about his mother, about the first time he was forced to hold a gun at 13. I told him about Francesca, about the scar that never really closed, about the moment I first began to believe that even someone who had done terrible things could still choose a different life. I didn't forgive his past, but I accepted it as a part of the man he was trying to become. One morning, when sunlight fell across the thin blanket that covered him, I placed a folded piece of paper on the bedside table. My resignation letter. Daniel looked from the paper to me. "You're sure about this?" I nodded. I used to think my work was the only thing holding me together, but now I know it isn't what keeps me standing. It's who. I hesitated. "Ryan, you." He said nothing, just pushed himself up carefully, still wincing with the movement. Then he reached for my hand, drawing me closer. His forehead touched mine. His breath was still heavy, but his eyes had softened. "You could still have another life, Liz," he murmured. "You could still go back." I shook my head. "There's no going back. Not after I followed you into the dark. That woman, the one I used to be, she's gone. And I don't regret it." For the first time in months, peace filled my voice when I said those words. Because I knew, beyond any doubt, that this choice was mine. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but out of love. Not the gentle kind, the kind that survives only when the world is kind in return. This was the kind of love born in blood, betrayal, and pain, the kind that grows from two people who have seen the worst of themselves and still choose to stay. I had chosen Daniel. Not Daniel Moretti of the past, the name whispered in fear, but the man before me now, carrying his darkness, his scars, his unfinished redemption. And somehow, from that darkness, I felt something new stirring, something small, something alive, a seed waiting to take root. The old building sat quietly in the middle of a working-class neighborhood on the west side of the city, a place that had once been a laundromat before time and neglect had peeled its paint and left its windows gray with dust. But on that first Monday morning, when I stepped inside, the glass had been cleaned until it caught the light, and the tired walls seemed to breathe again. A few rows of waiting chairs lined the narrow hallway. The front desk was modest but neat, and hanging just beyond it, written in soft, careful script, was a small wooden sign. Asterisk Moretti Clinic. Asterisk. No banner outside, no advertisement, no grand opening, just a quiet place meant for those who had nowhere else to go. People without insurance, without papers, or without anyone left to trust. Daniel stood by the door in a white shirt and worn jeans, looking nothing like the man I had first met. No sharp suits, no armor of confidence. There were shadows under his eyes, but behind them, a light I hadn't seen before. When I approached, He said nothing, only handed me a small stack of patient files. 12 appointments this week, he said simply. Most of them are immigrants, a few with old records, one elderly woman with no family. I flipped through the files. Every name was a story written in the margins of this city. Every face, someone who had fallen through the cracks. They all knew who Daniel was, or had been. And still, they came. When I asked one woman, a middle-aged Mexican named Clara, why she trusted us, she smiled faintly and said in broken English, because he was bad once, now he's trying to be good. People like that, they don't betray. I didn't know whether her words made me proud or broke my heart, but I understood. There are places in this world where the past isn't a burden, it's the proof that change can be real. I began seeing patients that morning in a small room at the end of the hall. The equipment was basic, nothing close to what I had at the community center, but it was enough to ease a child's fever, to clean a wound, to steady someone's breath. No one asked if I still had my license. No one questioned the way I prescribed from memory. They only needed help, and I was the one still standing there to give it. At noon, Daniel brought lunch, grilled chicken, and salad, still warm. He sat on the bench near the door as I ate, watching me with a quiet peace I rarely saw in him. You know, he said, his voice low. My mother used to dream of a clinic like this. In the old neighborhood, she worked her whole life, and never once had a real checkup. I looked at him. And now you've made that dream real, in your own way. He smiled, but the smile was tinged with sadness. He didn't argue. We both knew the truth. This clinic wasn't clean in the way the world demanded. It had been built with money that carried the scent of the past. Money that, if traced too far, would lead to names neither of us dared to speak. But it was here. It existed. And every day, it saved someone new. I thought about everything I'd lost: my title, my reputation, the trust of a system that once defined me. But when I watched a child's fever break, or saw an old man draw a steady breath after weeks of struggling with counterfeit medication, I knew I had chosen right. That afternoon, Ryan burst into the clinic, backpack bouncing against his shoulders, face flushed from the cold. He ran to me, waving a paper in his hand, telling me how his teacher had asked what his father did for work. He said, without hesitation, "My dad is a good man, not a businessman, not a director, just a good man." Daniel froze for a moment, then knelt down, resting a hand on Ryan's head. "I'll try to be, son," he said softly. And in that single moment, I saw not the shadowed figure whose name had once haunted half the city, but a man quietly rebuilding his life, piece by fragile piece, in a small clinic no one would ever notice, in a corner of a city too loud to care. Each night, after the doors closed and the lights dimmed, I sat beside him at the desk, our hands brushing over the pages of patient logs and medication lists. We planned the next day together, side by side, with a kind of silent faith that didn't need to be spoken. The Times Moretti Clinic Times wasn't going to change the world, but it was saving us, one day at a time. The wind that morning carried the sharp, clean cold of Chicago in late November, the kind that bit gently at your cheeks, the kind that made the breath between two people visible. The cemetery lay quiet under a thin veil of frost. The trees stood bare, their branches tracing gray lines against the winter sky. Somewhere in the distance, the bell of an early mass rang out, deep and solemn. I remembered another grave, another winter, the night I thought everything had ended. The rain, the loneliness, the hollow ache of loss. And now, I stood again before a stone, but not alone. Daniel's hand was wrapped around mine, warm, steady. Ryan followed behind us, clutching a small bouquet of daisies in both arms, his breath turning to mist as he walked. The name carved into the marble was Times Francesca Moretti, asterisk. Beneath it, in Italian, a few simple words, asterisk, a mother, a lover, a woman who never gave up hope, asterisk. Daniel had been silent the entire drive. His face was calm, but his eyes carried something deeper, something reverent, almost fragile. He crouched by the grave and touched the edge of the stone, tracing the letters like he was tracing a memory. "You know," he began softly, "my mother once said she'd give anything just to see me live quietly. Not hiding, not fighting, just living." He paused, swallowing hard. "I never gave her that. I never even said goodbye. But maybe," his voice broke slightly, "maybe she can see me now, trying." I knelt beside him and slipped my hand into his. "You don't have to prove anything," I said. "She's always seen you." For the first time that morning, he smiled faint, trembling, real. Then, slowly, he stood. And before I could ask what he was doing, He turned, lowered himself on one knee in the damp grass, and looked up at me. There was no grand speech, no ring of diamonds, no crowd, only the sound of the wind moving through the dead leaves, the earth beneath our feet, and the pulse of his voice. "Liz," he said, "I can't promise perfection. I don't have a beautiful past, and I can't promise a life without danger. But if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my days proving that love can grow out of the dark, that even those of us who've lost our way can still learn how to love and how to protect. Will you keep walking beside me, not just through the storm, but when the sky is clear too?" The world went very still. My eyes stung, but the tears that came weren't of fear or surprise. They were the kind that come when you realize you've survived everything you thought would destroy you, and somehow, your heart is still beating. I nodded. "Yes," I whispered. "Not just because I love you, but because I believe in who you're becoming." Behind us, Ryan clapped his small hands, laughing a bright, unguarded sound that seemed to melt the frost around us. Daniel rose and pulled me into his arms. The cold fell away. For a moment, it was only the warmth of his heartbeat against mine, the weight of his promise between us, and the quiet witness of the stone before us. I thought of Francesca then, a woman I had never met, but who suddenly felt close, almost familiar. A mother who had believed her son could be more than what the world had made of him. The wind shifted, and for the briefest second, I could swear it carried her blessing. The cold was still there, but I was warm, because we were no longer standing at the end of something, but at the beginning of something new. And I knew, with a certainty that reached to the marrow of me, love doesn't have to be born in light. It only needs the courage to walk out of the dark, and I had found that courage. Here, beside him, before his mother's grave. That morning, sunlight spilled gently across the worn wooden desk of the Moretti Clinic, catching the edges of the patient files I was sorting through, when a sudden wave of dizziness swept over me. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. It wasn't the first time I'd felt tired lately, but this was different, deeper, quieter, like a whisper rising from within. By noon, curiosity had given way to certainty. I took one of the leftover test kits from the supply cabinet, locked the door, and waited. When the faint pink line deepened into two, clear and undeniable, I forgot how to breathe. I sat there for what felt like a lifetime, my hand trembling around the small plastic stick. Not from fear, but from the knowledge that everything was about to change again. That afternoon, Daniel came back from his meeting with the lawyer about transferring part of the clinic's ownership to the community. I was still sitting in the same chair, my notebook open but untouched. He stepped through the door, and when our eyes met, I didn't try to soften the truth. "I'm pregnant," I said. Daniel froze. The air seemed to still around us. Then he moved quickly, silently crossed the space between us, and knelt beside me, his hands warm against my knees. His eyes shone, wide and bright, as if for the first time in his life he was seeing something holy. "Are you sure?" he asked, barely above a whisper. I nodded. He didn't speak again. He just pulled me into his arms and held me, his breath shaking against my shoulder. For him, this wasn't just news, it was redemption. A chance to do right, to love right, to be the father he had once longed for but never had. That night, the three of us sat around the small kitchen table, Daniel, Ryan, and me, under the soft glow of the yellow lamp. Dinner was nothing fancy, just a bowl of soup, but the room overflowed with laughter. Ryan didn't fully understand what was happening. He only knew his mother was happy, and his father couldn't stop holding her hand. So he laughed too, his joy echoing off the walls. I sat there, one hand resting lightly on my still flat stomach, thinking of the fragile life just beginning to form inside me, already changing everything about how I saw the world. I thought of the rain-soaked night I had collapsed in front of a stranger's grave, of Francesca and the weight of her absence, of the woman I used to be broken, ashamed, trying to make sense of loss. And I thought, perhaps if Francesca's daughter were still alive, she would have wanted me to find peace, to believe that after all the darkness, there could still be light. Now, that light was here, not only in the man beside me, who had walked through his own shadows, but within me, a heart once fractured, now whole, ready for a new beginning. My story may not make sense to everyone. Some will never understand why a doctor would choose to love a man who once lived in the underworld, or why I would risk my reputation for something as delicate as faith in change. But if you have ever lost everything, if you've ever raised a child alone, stared into a mirror and failed to recognize yourself, then perhaps you will understand. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person who truly sees you, one arm willing to hold you when you are at your weakest, and in that moment, you know you have found where you belong. Thank you for walking with me from the first tears I shed beside a stranger's grave to this quiet miracle in a small clinic that bears the name of the man who once made the city tremble. My story isn't perfect, but it's real. And if, somehow, you saw a part of yourself in it, don't leave in silence. Tell me what you felt. Have you ever stood at the edge between light and darkness? Which way did you choose? Share your thoughts below. I want to hear you, truly. And if this story touched something in you, please subscribe to Time's Dear Single Mom *, like the video, and share it with another mother who might need a little hope tonight. This channel will always be here, bringing you real, human stories of struggle, love, and quiet courage. Thank you for staying until the end. I wish you peace, strength, and days filled with laughter. Until the next story, goodbye.